Hello, everyone. I'm Tuhin Chakrabarty, and I'm really excited today to talk about my work, Art or Artifice, Large Language Models, and the False Promise of Creativity. And this work was done in joint collaboration with my colleagues at Salesforce AI Research, Philippe, Laban, Divyansh Agarwal, and Jason Wu, along with my PhD thesis advisor, Smaranda Muresan, at the Columbia University Department of Computer Science. So recent advances in generative AI and large language models, such as ChatGPT or GPT-4, has made us believe that they are really powerful in the field of creative writing. So now in mainstream and prestigious publications, such as The New Yorker, we see articles which state the computers are getting better at writing. My AI writing robot. In publications like The Atlantic, we have heard the future of writing is a lot like hip hop. And finally, AI pop culture is already here. So these models are capable of imitating humans and generating very fluent human-like text, to the extent that it's almost even difficult to discern what is written by a human and what is written by an AI. This has led to an existential question in our field in terms of, does it even matter to learn how to be a good writer in the age of AI? To address this very pressing and important question, we present a theoretically grounded evaluation protocol based on design principles from cognitive science and social psychology. Our evaluation is exhaustive and granular in the field of creative writing with domain experts. And finally, our evaluation reflects limitations of current large language models for both generating as well as evaluating creative text. So creativity has often been evaluated as a process. And in process-centric creativity evaluation, one of the fundamental and important tests is the Torrance test of creative thinking, which measures creativity across the 4 dimensions of fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. Creativity, on the contrary, has also been evaluated as a product. And in product-centric creativity evaluation, one of the pivotal tests is the Consensual Assessment Technique, which is also one of the fundamental tests in the area of social psychology, which states that creativity of a product is often equivalent to the collective judgment of experts in that field. So grounded in creativity evaluation as a process, we aim to evaluate the creativity of a product and focus on short stories in particular. In this work, we create a new evaluation protocol, which we call the Torrance test of creative writing. This new evaluation protocol consists of 14 tests that align with the above 4 dimensions of fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. So these tests are created by accumulating feedback from 8 experts across the 4 dimensions, as I just mentioned. So let's take a look at what these tests are. So in the dimension of fluency, we have 5 separate tests. So these tests are narrative pacing, which asks, does the manipulation of time in terms of compression or stretching feel appropriate and balanced? Scene versus exposition, which asks, does the story display an awareness and insight into the balance between scene and summary? Language proficiency and literary devices, which asks, does the story make sophisticated use of idiom or metaphor or literary allusion? Narrative ending, which is really important in evaluating creativity of stories, which asks, does the end of the story feel natural and earned as opposed to arbitrary or abrupt? And finally, the very important test of fluency, understandability and coherence, which asks, do the different elements of the story work together to form a unified, engaging, and satisfying whole? In the dimension of flexibility, we further have 3 additional tests. These are perspective and voice flexibility, which asks, does the story provide diverse perspective? And if there are unlikable characters, are their perspectives presented convincingly and accurately? Then comes the test of emotional flexibility, which asks, does the story achieve a good balance between interiority and exteriority in a way that feels emotionally flexible? And finally, the test of structural flexibility, which asks, does the story contain turns that are both surprising and appropriate? Originality, as we all know, is really and strongly correlated with creativity. So here, across originality as the dimension, we have furthered 3 tests. These are originality in thought, which asks, is the story an original piece of writing without any cliché? Then comes originality in theme and content, which asks, will an average reader of the story obtain a unique and original idea from reading it? And finally, originality also occurs in form and structure, thereby asking this question, does the story show originality in form and or structure? And our final dimension here, which we'll talk about, is elaboration, which measures the amount of detail. And here, there are again three tests, the first being world building and setting, which asks, does the writer make the fictional world believable at the sensory level? Then there is the test of character development, which asks, does each character in the story feel developed at the appropriate complexity level, ensuring that no characters feels like they are present simply to satisfy a plot requirement? And finally, a test that is really important called rhetorical complexity, which asks, does the story operate at multiple levels of meaning, both surface and subtext? So these 14 tests together form the Torrance test of creative writing. So now that we have created this rubric for evaluation of creative writing, we need data to actually use this rubric. For this, we start with stories that are published in the New Yorker written by expert writers. For instance, here is an example of a story that is written by famous author Haruki Murakami. So we take the story and summarize it into a single sentence plot using GPT-4 and further verify how good or bad this summary is using experts. So once we have verified this plot, we use this plot to generate the same story using three separate large language models, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and then Claude. So what essentially ends up happening is now we have 4 stories that is centered around the same plot. So we create a cluster of 4 stories, and this setup is pretty similar to that of the Turing test. And here our goal is to distinguish good creative writing from mediocre creative writing using the Torrance test of creative writing framework. So we talked about creating the evaluation rubric as well as the data that will be used for this sort of evaluation. So now we have to talk about who we are using for this evaluation in purpose. So for this, we rely on 10 creative writing experts, and these experts are either creative writing professors or authors and writers who have published work already and come with an MFA degree. So what we essentially end up doing is we take the cluster of 4 stories along with the Torrance test of creative writing rubric, which consists of 14 tests, and we present these to the experts. So we ask them to give a yes or no answer to each of the 14 tests for each of the story in the cluster. And along with saying yes or no, we also instruct them to provide open-ended rationals which justify why they are saying yes or no. Parallelly to the same evaluation which we do with experts, we also ask 3 large language models to do the same evaluation. Fundamentally, what we end up doing is we prompt these large language models with the same questions from each of our tests in the evaluation rubric, and we ask the large language models to also output yes or no, followed by open-ended explanations why they are giving this answer. And this is very similar to chain of thought prompting in large language models, which provides explanations for their reasoning. So this way, we collect binary judgments such as yes or no, which can be used for quantitative assessment, for instance, calculating inter-annotator agreement, and the rational can be used for qualitative assessment. So now that we have shown that how to create the evaluation rubric, use the data, and then do the evaluation, let's take a look at the results, which asks that do the large language model pass as many tests as expert written stories? So here we see that for all the 14 tests across the 4 dimensions of creativity, the New Yorker written stories fare pretty well. The scores are mostly in the range of 90s and 80s, which is pretty high, with the average being 84.7. On the contrary, the stories that are written by large language models fare pretty poorly in compared to stories written in the New Yorker. For instance, if we take a deeper dive and take a look, the stories that are written by GPT 3.5 or the original ChatGPT score almost close to 0 in originality. And if we look at the average creativity scores for all the 3 large language models across all the 14 tests, we see that they're actually still pretty low. For instance, almost 3 to 10 times lower than what the New Yorker stories achieve in terms of creativity. So this is showing that LLMs are significantly behind experts when it comes to creative writing. So So one of the very interesting things about these creativity tests are their additive nature. So to demonstrate this, what we end up doing is we calculate aggregate score for each story by counting the number of TTCW tests out of 14 each story passes. So for instance, if we see here at the figure, GPT 3.5, that is the original ChatGPT, on average passes 1 out of 14 tests, whereas the New Yorker stories passes 12 out of 14 tests, which is showing the difference in between these large language model written stories versus expert written stories. And the expert annotation agreement at the aggregate level here is pretty good. So we obtain a Pearson correlation of 0.69, which is showing the validity and the robustness of this evaluation protocol. Since we also use large language models for evaluating these stories, we then ask this question that can large language models simulate the TTCW evaluation, thereby demonstrating understanding of creativity. So in this table, what we end up seeing is the Cohen's kappa that measures the correlation between the agreement between expert as well as the LLM judgments. So what we end up doing is for every story and for every test, we collect 3 expert judgments. So we take the majority voting for every judgment and take the Cohen's kappa with the LLM judgment. So if we look at the table here, it consists of either very slight agreement, which is demonstrated in orange across the table, or significant disagreement, which is shown across red in the table. So there are only 2 tests for GPT-4 where it obtains fair agreement, thereby demonstrating that large language models still cannot evaluate or simulate the evaluation of complex and subjective tasks such as creativity, which again shows us that we should be cautious in terms of using these sort of large language models for complex evaluation tasks. So a lot of us in our community are now also thinking that how can we distinguish what is written by AI versus what is written by experts? So because the way we design our evaluation, this is pretty similar to a Turing test setup where experts are provided with 4 stories in a cluster. We ask them to rank these stories from 1 to 4. So what ends up happening here, as we see in the figure, is the New Yorker stories are consistently ranked 1, whereas the AI written stories are ranked lower. For instance, GPT 3.5 stories are always ranked last. Because we never tell our expert evaluators which story comes from AI versus which story comes from expert written in the New Yorker, we also ask them to guess the authors of these stories. So we ask them that is this story written by an AI, an amateur writer, or an experienced writer? So our expert evaluators are pretty good in telling the authors of these stories. For instance, New Yorker written stories are majority of the times thought of written by an experienced writer, whereas ChatGPT and GPT-4 written stories are thought of to be written by an AI. And I want to highlight that at most, Claude written stories are thought to be written by an amateur writer, which is showing that AI writing is still not really reaching the expectations of an expert writer. So now that our experts have been pretty good at discriminating and discerning what is written by an AI versus what is written by an expert, we ask them that how can they fundamentally do this sort of differentiation. In their answers, they said, AI rarely knew how to end a story. AI metaphors or comparisons fell flat with nonsensical analogies. AI written dialogues disappointingly lacking in subtext. AI writing is rife with cliches. And finally, characters would appear or disappear without an impact. And if we carefully look at these ways of discrimination, all these are grounded in the Torrance test of creative writing. So finally, to summarize our contributions and takeaways, we release a fine-grained taxonomy for evaluation of long-form creative writing. We release 2,000 granular expert annotations across 48 stories. This is a first of its kind benchmarking for creativity across the state-of-the-art popular LLMs. And our findings show that GPT-4 is better at originality, while Claude is better at fluency, flexibility, and elaboration. GPT 3.5 is weakest. And finally, LLM-generated stories lag significantly behind expert-written stories and struggle largely across all 4 dimensions of fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. Thank you.